Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into some really interesting early psychology. We're going to explore how our attention affects, well, how fast we react.
And we're focusing specifically on the work of James McKeen Cattell. He wrote this paper, Attention and Reaction. I think it was first published way back in 1893.
That's right, 1893. And it was later included in his collection Man of Science in 1947. It's a fascinating look.
It really is. And the core question he's wrestling with is something debated quite a bit back then, especially because of Wilhelm Wundt.
Right, Wundt. So the question is, when you react to something, say a sound, does it make a difference if you focus your attention on the sound itself or on the movement you're about to make, like pressing a key?
Exactly. Wundt and some others had sort of established this idea that focusing on the sensory input, they called it the sensorial reaction, actually made your reaction time a bit longer.
Longer than focusing on the movement, the muscular reaction. People like Lange, Marcius, Titchener, they'd all reported this longer sensorial time.
Yeah. And Wundt's explanation was that this longer time involved an extra mental step. Like you had to consciously perceive or understand the stimulus first. He called it an apperception process.
Okay, so an extra cognitive step taking up time.
Pretty much. But Cattell, he was a bit skeptical about that interpretation. He didn't necessarily disagree that practiced muscular reactions could become super fast, almost automatic.
But he questioned if focusing on the sensation inherently meant this slower, conscious processing step.
Exactly. And, even trying to measure the supposed apperception time proved really difficult. Researchers in Wundt's own lab tried. Friedrich, Trautschuld, others.
And Cattell found it tricky too.
Yeah, the measurements were just all over the place. Very variable. Even Wundt later admitted it was hard to get a solid, objective measure.
Plus, Cattell had this sort of counter-argument based on everyday experience.
Right. Think about things we do automatically, like playing piano or speaking or skilled manual work.
Your attention isn't usually on the individual muscle movements, is it?
No. It's on the goal. Like the music you're making, or the words you want to say, or the thing you're crafting. In fact, if you do focus too much on the mechanics,
it can actually mess you up, make it less smooth.
Totally. So Cattell thought, why should focusing on the incoming sensory signal necessarily slow you down through this conscious step? It felt a bit off to him.
Which means he must have been quite surprised then when some initial findings did seem to show longer reaction times for sensorial focus.
He was. It kind of went against his intuition that a more reflex-like reaction should be the fastest possible.
And this wasn't his first look at this either, right? Didn't he do earlier work?
Yeah, he'd done some experiments with Berger previously, and back then they hadn't actually found much difference based on where attention was directed. The results were pretty similar.
Okay, so maybe some conflicting data points out there.
Seems like it. So to really get to the bottom of it, Cattell set up some very careful experiments in 1892. He used sound stimuli and also electrical stimuli.
And knowing Cattell, the methodology was probably rigorous.
Oh, absolutely. He took like 100 reactions for each average, grouped them in series of 10, made sure not to exclude any measurements, no jumping the gun, really meticulous stuff.
So what did he find when he tested himself under these strict conditions?
This is where it gets interesting. For Cattell himself, his actual speed, the reaction time, was pretty much the same whether he focused on the movement or the sensation. No significant difference.
So aligning with his earlier Berger results then.
Speed-wise, yes. But here's the twist. When he focused on the sensorial condition, his reactions were actually more regular, more consistent, less variation.
So same speed, but less variability when focusing on the stimulus. Why did he think that was?
Well, he wondered himself if maybe his extensive practice with reaction time experiments or even his own theoretical ideas might have influenced his results. Maybe he was just so practiced it didn't matter where he focused.
That makes sense. So he needed other people to test.
Exactly. He brought in 2 other subjects. First, his wife, identified as subject J. She did tests in May 1890.
Was she experienced with this?
Not really. She'd only done about 20 practice trials before, so pretty naive to it all. They tested her with sound stimuli, 50 muscular focus, 50 sensorial focus.
And her results?
Very similar to Cattell's, actually. Her reaction times were short, they were regular, and crucially, there wasn't a meaningful difference between focusing on the movement versus the sound.
Okay, so that's 2 people showing little difference.
Yeah.
Did he test her again?
He did a couple of years later in July 1892. This time she was aware of the earlier results, which is an interesting factor.
Did that change anything?
Apparently not. She did 100 muscular and 100 sensorial reactions to sound, and then the same again for electrical stimuli. And again, the results were consistent, quick, regular reactions with very little difference based on where attention was directed.
So far, the evidence seems to be stacking against Wundt's idea of a universally longer sensorial time, at least for these two individuals.
Right. But then came subject D. This was Dr. C.S. Dolly, tested also in July 1892.
What was his background?
He had experience reacting to electrical stimuli, but, and this is key, he wasn't aware of this whole muscular versus sensorial distinction they were testing. He didn't know the theory behind it.
Okay, so a bit experienced, but naive about the specific hypothesis. And his results.
This is the kicker. Dr. Dolly's results were completely different. When he focused on the sensory input, the electrical stimulus, his reaction time was actually significantly shorter, about 3/4 the length compared to when he focused on the movement.
Shorter, not longer.
Shorter. And not only shorter, but also much more consistent, less variable. He even subjectively reported that the sensorial reaction felt quicker and easier to him.
Wow. That completely flips the script on the earlier findings reported by Lange and others.
Absolutely. It's also worth noting that Dr. Dolly's overall reaction times were generally longer and more irregular than Cattell's or subject J's. Cattell suggested this might mean his reactions weren't quite as automatic or reflex-like to begin with.
Okay, so let's try to piece this all together. What was Cattell's final conclusion after seeing these quite different results?
Well, his main takeaway was that Lange's claim that sensorial reactions are always longer simply wasn't universally true. It depended on the person.
So for individuals like himself and his wife, who had very quick, regular, almost automatic reactions, the direction of attention didn't seem to make much difference to the speed.
Exactly. But for someone like Dr. Dolly, whose reactions were perhaps less practiced, less automatic, slower overall, directing attention did matter. And for him, focusing on the movement seemed to slow things down and make them more variable.
Which is the opposite of what Lange found, where focusing on the sensation slowed things down for his subjects.
Precisely. So Cattell's conclusion was more nuanced. It suggested that for less automatic reactions, attention focus could increase reaction time, but which focus caused the slowdown might vary between individuals. It could be the movement focus for some, or the sensory focus for others.
So the relationship between attention and reaction time is more complex than Wundt or Lange initially proposed. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing.
Definitely not. It seems to interact with individual differences, maybe skill level, maybe how automatic the response is. The contrast between the highly practiced Cattell and subject J and the less automatic subject D is really the core finding here.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Consider your own experiences. When you're doing something really familiar, something you've practiced a lot, versus learning something new.
Yeah, where's your attention? Does focusing on the sensation versus the action change how well you do it? Does it feel faster one way or the other?
And could that change as you get better at it? Does practice maybe lessen the impact of where you focus? It's definitely some interesting food for thought from this classic study.